There is a moment in a life when awakening stops feeling like illumination and begins to feel like erosion. Not the dramatic kind that breaks loudly, but the slow removal of what once made survival possible. This is not the phase that people celebrate. This is not the awakening that produces language. Belonging or meaning, it is the stage where the psyche begins to withdraw its previous permissions, where the unconscious no longer allows you to continue living through the structures that once kept you safe. For many who carry heightened sensitivity, this moment arrives not as insight, but as restriction. The world does not expand. It contracts. Roles lose their usefulness. Responses that once brought connection now produce exhaustion, emotional attunement. Once a bridge begins to feel like exposure, you do not become less capable. You become less able to tolerate the cost of remaining who you were. This is the stage most never reach, not because it is hidden, but because it requires something the psyche resists with every defense it has ever learned, the surrender of identity without the guarantee of replacement. Up to this point, awakening often feels additive. You gain language, you recognize patterns, you understand wounds, you see dynamics clearly. Even suffering carries meaning, even pain feels purposeful. But here, meaning begins to dissolve. Insight no longer consoles. Awareness does not stabilize. What you see does not free you, it removes you from the life you were still inhabiting. This is not failure, but it is loss. The empath at this threshold often feels betrayed by their own depths. What once allowed them to navigate others now isolates them from everyone. The capacity to feel does not disappear, it sharpens. And with that sharpening comes an unbearable clarity, the realization that many bonds were sustained not by mutual recognition, but by unconscious agreements to remain unfinished. At this stage, the psyche no longer allows unconscious sacrifice. You cannot keep absorbing what others refuse to face. You cannot continue translating chaos into coherence for people who depend on your confusion to avoid their own. The self begins to intervene, not gently, but definitively. And when the self intervenes, it does not explain itself. Life begins to strip away the places where you were still over-functioning emotionally. Conversations become intolerable. Familiar dynamics feel invasive. You find yourself withdrawing, not because you want solitude, but because proximity now carries a psychic cost your nervous system refuses to pay. This withdrawal is often misunderstood. From the outside, it resembles coldness, detachment, even arrogance. From the inside, it feels like being skinned alive in a world that still expects you to perform warmth. You are not becoming less compassionate, you are becoming unable to betray yourself in order to maintain belonging. Here, the empath often encounters a terrifying reversal. The qualities that once made them valued, availability, emotional fluency, receptivity, no longer generate connection, they generate depletion, and yet, without them, the old identity collapses. The psyche enters a no man's land, unable to return, unable to advance, This is the threshold in Jungian terms. This is where the ego's previous alliance with adaptation breaks down. Adaptation has served its purpose. It allowed survival, integration, and social belonging, but it has also become a defense against individuation. The psyche now demands a deeper alignment, one that cannot be achieved through empathy as function. The empath feels this as exile, not because they are rejected outright, but because they can no longer participate in relationships that require self-erasure as the price of intimacy. The world does not expel them. They outgrow the conditions that once kept them included. And this outgrowing does not feel like progress. It feels like disorientation, like standing between lives with no language for what is happening. The unconscious intensifies during this stage. Dreams become heavy. Symbols repeat. The same images return with a quiet insistence. Empty houses, locked rooms, long corridors, bodies shedding skins, faces without expressions. These are not messages to be decoded. They are confirmations of an inner state. Something old is no longer permitted to animate the future. What terrifies most people here is not the darkness, but the absence of instruction. There is no path to follow, no ritual to complete, no affirmation that reassures. The psyche has entered a phase where guidance comes only through subtraction. You lose energy for what once energized you. You lose patience for what once felt tolerable. You lose interest in explaining yourself, not because you are superior, but because explanation itself has become a form of distortion. Words collapse under the weight of what is being reconfigured. This is where many retreat. They reframe the discomfort as burnout. They pathologize the withdrawal. They search for a method to regain motivation, re-enter engagement, restore connection, and in doing so, they step back from the threshold, returning to a functional identity that feels safer than the void. But those who do not retreat, those who cannot enter a deeper solitude, here the psyche begins to dismantle the empathic persona itself, not empathy as capacity, but empathy as identity. The unconscious exposes the hidden bargain beneath chronic attunement. The hope that by understanding others deeply enough, one might earn the right to exist without conflict. This hope must die, and it does not die gently. The empath at this stage often experiences a collapse in relational certainty. People they once felt aligned with now feel distant or even hostile. Familiar bonds strain under the weight of new boundaries that were not consciously chosen but instinctively enforced. The body withdraws before the mind can justify it. This creates guilt, a profound guilt, because the old identity was built around responsiveness, around being needed, around being emotionally present even when it cost something. Now, the refusal to participate feels like betrayal not of others, but of a self-image that once provided coherence. The psyche does not soothe this guilt. It allows it to burn, because guilt is the final guardian of the old structure. Only when guilt is endured without resolution does the deeper shift begin. This is not the stage of empowerment. It is the stage of disintegration without replacement. The old meanings no longer hold. The new ones have not arrived. And the empath, stripped of their adaptive role, faces a terrifying question without an answer. Who am I when my sensitivity no longer functions as a service? There is no response, only a pressure to remain present as the question deepens. The unconscious does not rush this process. Time stretches, weeks blur, months feel suspended, life continues externally. But internally, something fundamental has stalled. The psyche is reorganizing at a depth that does not communicate in language. Here, many feel watched not by others, but by life itself, as if the self has turned its gaze inward, observing whether the ego will attempt to reclaim, control, or surrender to transformation. This observation is not kind, it is precise. Every attempt to revert, to overgive, to over-explain, to reinsert oneself into familiar roles produces immediate fatigue, anxiety, or inner resistance. The body refuses, the psyche closes ranks, the threshold holds. This is why most do not reach this stage, not because it is exclusive, but because it demands something that feels indistinguishable from loss without reward. Yet something essential is happening. The empath is being severed from the unconscious compulsion to merge, not to become isolated forever, but to become real for the first time. The psyche is preparing the ground for a form of relationship that does not depend on self-abandonment. But this preparation feels like exile, and exile has no timeline. You do not feel wiser here. You feel quieter, heavier, less certain. The world feels further away. Your inner life feels closer but not comforting. There is no joy in this closeness, only honesty. The self does not announce itself with light. It arrives as necessity, and necessity does not ask for consent. You are here because something in you could no longer survive the old way, and whatever comes next cannot be reached by effort, positivity, or understanding. It can only emerge after the psyche has completed its refusal. This is the final stage most never reach, not because it ends in triumph, but because it begins in disappearance. And disappearance frightens those who have spent their lives being seen. As this threshold deepens, something subtle but irreversible occurs. The psyche stops negotiating. Earlier phases of awakening often feel dialogical. You reflect, interpret, adjust. You learn to name patterns, to soften reactions, to choose differently. But here, the unconscious withdraws from dialogue altogether. It does not argue with you. It does not persuade. It simply removes access. You reach for the old responses and find nothing there. This is not repression, it is refusal. The empath often experiences this as an internal silence that feels hostile rather than peaceful, not the silence of clarity, but the silence of systems shutting down, emotional reflexes that once activated automatically now stall mid-gesture. The urge to comfort, to explain, to attune still arises, but it collapses under its own weight. You cannot finish the movement. This is where confusion intensifies, because nothing external has necessarily changed. The same people are present, the same dynamics attempt to resume, yet something inside you no longer responds. Not with anger, not with judgment, with absence. And absence is misinterpreted by everyone. Those who once relied on your emotional availability begin to feel destabilized. They may accuse you of withdrawal, coldness, or transformation into someone unrecognizable. But what they are sensing is not change. It is the removal of an unconscious function they depended on. You were not merely relating to them, you were regulating something for them. At this stage, the psyche withdraws that function not as punishment, as correction. For the empath, this is often unbearable because their identity was entwined with usefulness, with being the one who could hold complexity, soothe tension, translate pain. Without that role, they feel emptied, not liberated. This emptiness is not the void of nihilism. It is the void of an identity being dismantled before the next structure is available. Jung understood this moment well. He described it not as enlightenment, but as dismemberment of the ego's previous orientation. The ego, once aligned with adaptation, must now relinquish its authority, and it does so reluctantly, through suffering. Here, the psyche begins to expose the shadowed motivations beneath empathy itself. Not cruelty, not manipulation, but fear of separation, fear of conflict, fear of existing without relational confirmation. This fear does not vanish when it is seen. It loses its legitimacy. And when fear loses legitimacy, it can no longer organize behavior. The empath may notice an unsettling shift. They no longer feel compelled to prevent discomfort in others, not because they wish harm, but because the inner command to rescue has dissolved. The nervous system no longer responds to emotional urgency as a call to action. This creates a moral crisis. You may wonder whether you are becoming indifferent, whether something essential has died, whether this withdrawal signals a failure of compassion. But the psyche does not answer these questions. It allows them to echo unanswered, because this stage is not about reassurance, it is about severance. What is being severed is not care but compulsive responsibility. The empath is forced to confront a truth that destabilizes their self-concept. Much of their sensitivity was organized around avoiding a deeper confrontation with selfhood. Attunement became a way to remain externally oriented, to delay the formation of a solid center. Now, the psyche demands that center, and it demands it by removing the option to disperse. This is where solitude deepens, not as chosen retreat, but as enforced isolation, even in company. You feel alone, not lonely, but unaccompanied. The familiar resonance with others is gone. Conversations feel distant, shallow, or intrusive. The inner world feels more real than the outer, but also more demanding. This is not depression, though it may resemble it. Depression numbs, this sharpens. You feel more, not less, but what you feel no longer translates into connection. It folds inward, demanding containment rather than expression. The empath often feels trapped between instincts, the instinct to withdraw completely and the instinct to remain visible. Neither feels viable. Withdrawal feels like disappearance. Visibility feels like violation. So you hover. In Jungian language, this is a suspension between opposites without synthesis, a holding pattern enforced by the self. You are not meant to resolve it. You are meant to endure it. Endurance here is not passive. It is an active refusal to falsify experience. Most people escape this stage by narrativizing it. They declare themselves healed, awakened, reborn. They adopt a language of completion that soothes the anxiety of not knowing. But those who remain at the threshold cannot lie convincingly to themselves anymore. Language feels thin. Affirmations feel hollow. Even insight feels insufficient. The psyche has moved beyond interpretation into reorganization. And reorganization is silent. You may notice your values shifting without your consent. What once felt important feels irrelevant. What once felt urgent feels trivial. This does not feel empowering. It feels disorienting, because motivation itself is being restructured. The empath often feels accused by this shift, as if they are abandoning something sacred. They may feel grief for the person they used to be, for the version of themselves that could remain emotionally available without collapsing. This grief is real, but it is not nostalgia for health. It is mourning for a survival strategy that can no longer sustain life. The psyche does not allow regression here. Attempts to re-inhabit the old role produce immediate exhaustion or anxiety. The body rebels, the threshold holds. This is where many experience psychosomatic symptoms: tightness in the chest, pressure in the head, fatigue without cause, sleep disturbances. These are not pathologies to be eliminated. They are signals of psychic tension, the strain of holding a position that has not yet been resolved. The empath may also experience a strange moral quiet. Judgments soften, not out of forgiveness, but out of disengagement. You see dynamics clearly, but you are no longer invested in correcting them. This withdrawal of investment can feel disturbing, as if something human is slipping away. But what is slipping away is not humanity. It is the compulsion to intervene. The psyche is teaching a harsh lesson. Not everything that can be felt must be acted upon. For someone whose identity was built around responsiveness, this lesson feels like annihilation. Yet the self insists, you are not meant to rescue, you are not meant to repair, you are not meant to remain open at any cost. You are meant to exist, and existence requires boundaries that empathy alone cannot provide. This is where the archetype of the hermit begins to emerge, not as an aspiration, but as a necessity. The psyche withdraws libido from the outer world and redirects it inward, not for contemplation, but for consolidation. This consolidation is uncomfortable. It requires you to sit with unanswered questions, unresolved tensions, and unintegrated impulses. There is no catharsis, only pressure. The empath may feel watched again not by others, but by an internal authority that tolerates no pretense. Every attempt to prematurely resolve the tension is quietly rejected. The threshold does not reward effort. It responds only to surrender, not surrender to peace, but surrender to process. This is why the stage feels endless, because the ego cannot complete it. Only the psyche can, and the psyche moves at its own pace. You are not being prepared for something dramatic. You are being stripped of what no longer belongs. What remains is not yet visible, but what is gone will not return. At a certain point within this threshold, something irreversible becomes clear, not as insight, but as bodily knowing. There is no path back to who you were. This realization does not arrive dramatically. It settles slowly, like a weight that refuses to lift. You notice it in small refusals. You can no longer perform interest where none exists. You cannot soften truth to preserve comfort. You cannot unsee what has been revealed not about others, but about yourself. The empath often grieves here, not because they are losing people, but because they are losing the ability to belong through adaptation. The old life remains available in form, but not in spirit. You could still participate, but you would have to betray something fundamental to do so. And the psyche will not allow that betrayal anymore. This is where the illusion of return collapses. Up to this point, there may have been hope that this was a phase, something to endure before re-entering life renewed. But here, renewal stops being imaginable. The psyche does not offer a vision of what comes next. It only confirms that the old orientation is finished. This confirmation often feels brutal. The empath may feel stripped of innocence, not moral innocence, but relational innocence. You see too clearly now how often your presence functioned as containment for others' unfinished lives. How often your empathy was used, sometimes unconsciously, as a stabilizing force that allowed others to avoid transformation. This realization does not produce anger. It produces distance, not emotional distance, but existential distance. You begin to stand apart, not above, not below, but outside the field where these dynamics operate. And this standing apart feels like exile because it removes you from the familiar economy of connection. People sense this shift. Some withdraw quietly, others intensify their demands. Some attempt to pull you back through guilt, nostalgia, or accusation. None of it works. Not because you are resisting, but because the internal mechanism that once responded has been dismantled. This dismantling creates a peculiar loneliness, not the loneliness of isolation, but the loneliness of inhabiting a position that few recognize. You are not withdrawn into yourself out of fear. You are held there by necessity. The empath often wonders whether this is what Jung meant by individuation, but the word feels inadequate here. Too clean, too resolved. What is happening feels messier, heavier, more ambiguous. Individuation, in this phase, does not feel like becoming oneself. It feels like losing every version of yourself that depended on external confirmation. There is no pride in this loss, only gravity. The psyche begins to withdraw energy not only from relationships, but from narratives, stories that once organized meaning about purpose, destiny, healing, awakening lose their coherence. They feel imposed, insufficient, or even manipulative. This collapse of narrative can be terrifying, because narrative is how the ego orients itself in time. Without it, existence feels suspended. You are no longer moving toward a goal. You are being held in a process without a visible end. This is where despair often emerges, not dramatic despair, but a quiet recognition that nothing familiar will rescue you from this state. No insight, no teacher, no practice. The empath may attempt to spiritualize the experience, to frame it as ascension, initiation, or divine testing. These frames may briefly soothe, but they do not hold. The psyche rejects them because they imply reward. This stage has none. What it has instead is inevitability. You begin to realize that this threshold was not chosen, it was not earned, it was not sought. It emerged because the psyche reached a limit beyond which the old mode of being could not continue without serious internal damage. In this sense, the threshold is not a gift, it is a correction, and correction does not consult the ego. The empath may notice a growing intolerance for false intimacy. Politeness feels draining. Emotional performativity feels invasive. Even kindness, when ungrounded, feels like a demand. This does not make you cruel. It makes you precise. You are no longer willing to blur yourself to keep others comfortable. This precision isolates, not because others reject it, but because most people are not oriented toward this level of honesty. They live within narratives that depend on mutual illusion. When you step outside those illusions, you disrupt the field. The psyche does not ask you to disrupt intentionally. It simply positions you where disruption occurs naturally. This can feel dangerous. You may feel exposed, unprotected, without role or shield. The empath's former defenses, agreeableness, attunement, emotional labor are gone, and nothing has replaced them yet. This nakedness is frightening, because now, if someone approaches, they encounter you directly. There is no buffer, no smoothing, no translation. Many cannot tolerate this. Some will project hostility, others will withdraw. A few may recognize something in you that unsettles them deeply. None of this is manageable through strategy. You are not meant to manage it. This is where the archetype of the orphan subtly emerges, not as abandonment by others, but as separation from the familiar structures of belonging. You are no longer held by the old world. but you are not yet held by anything new. The empath often feels suspended between identities, no longer the caretaker, not yet the sovereign self, something in between, raw, unstructured, undefined. This undefined state feels dangerous because it lacks social legitimacy. There is no recognized role for someone who refuses both self-erasure and domination, who will not merge, but also will not harden, so you exist without category. This is deeply unsettling for the ego, which relies on categorization to orient itself. Without category, you feel invisible and hyper-visible at once. Invisible because you do not fit existing frames. Hyper-visible because your presence disrupts them. The psyche tolerates this tension without offering relief, because relief would signal premature closure. You may notice a growing indifference to being understood, not contempt, but exhaustion. The effort to explain feels disproportionate to the outcome. Misunderstanding no longer feels like a threat. This is a crucial shift. When the need to be understood dissolves, something fundamental in the ego loosens. You are no longer negotiating your existence through others' perceptions. This does not feel empowering. It feels empty. But it is a necessary emptiness, because only in the absence of external orientation can an internal center begin to form. This center is not yet conscious. It does not announce itself. It exerts pressure rather than clarity. You feel it as a gravitational pull inward, a demand to remain still, observant, unreactive. This stillness is not peace. It is containment. The psyche is consolidating energy that was previously dispersed, and dispersion was your identity. Letting go of dispersion feels like death. And in a way, it is. The empath stands here, at the edge of something unnamed, knowing only this: the old life cannot resume, and the new life has not yet begun. This is the point of no return, not because something extraordinary happens, but because nothing does, and you remain. At this final stretch of the threshold, something subtle but decisive occurs. The pressure does not lift, but it changes direction. Earlier, the psyche pressed inward, dismantling roles, identities, orientations. Now, the pressure becomes gravitational, less violent, more constant. What remains is not clarity, but form, not a new identity, not a new purpose, a form of being that can withstand reality without distortion. This is where many expect revelation. They wait for a moment of understanding that explains the suffering retroactively, but nothing like that arrives. The psyche does not justify itself. It does not explain the cost. Instead, something quieter emerges, a capacity to remain intact without performance. This is not relief, it is stabilization. You notice it first in what no longer moves you. Emotional manipulation loses traction. Urgency loses authority. Drama fails to activate the nervous system, not because you are numb, but because you are no longer organized around response. This is the stage where empathy returns, but without compulsion. You can feel others deeply again, but the feeling no longer pulls you outward. It remains contained. This containment is not learned. It is enforced by everything that came before. The empath often misreads this containment as hardness, but hardness resists feeling. This does not resist. It simply does not surrender itself. What has changed is not your capacity to feel, but your willingness to be used by feeling. This is the difference most never reach. Earlier stages of awakening glorify sensitivity. They treat it as virtue, gift, calling, but sensitivity without center becomes a liability. The psyche corrects this imbalance not by dulling sensitivity, but by building a structure strong enough to hold it.